Today, we're tackling a really significant question. Could mining the deep seabed be the key to unlocking our critical mineral supply chains? And, what would that mean for the world stage?
Exactly. We've got a fascinating new report that's really dug into the potential of this whole emerging industry.
Right. And for our listeners who want to get up to speed quickly on something that could be, well, pretty transformative.
We're basically extracting the crucial insights from this quite complex report, trying to give you a clear understanding of what's really at stake here.
So our source today, it's this detailed piece of research, and it examines just how likely and impactful seabed mining could actually be.
Yeah, it looks at everything from supplying those essential minerals for, all our tech,
to the economic ripple effects for developing nations, and even the bigger shifts in global power dynamics.
That's it. So our mission here is to cut through the noise, essentially. Deliver the core knowledge you need without feeling overwhelmed.
Okay, let's dive in then. The report kicks off by highlighting a major vulnerability. Our reliance, really, on China for critical minerals.
And that's such a crucial starting point. This isn't just about, trade figures. It really touches on the security of supply for vital industries.
And the potential for geopolitical pressure, right?
Absolutely. The report reminds us of past disruptions, like with rare earth elements maybe a decade ago, and more recently with things like gallium, germanium.
Graphite, antimony.
Yeah, exactly. And China's dominance even extends to key battery components. It gives them significant leverage, no doubt about it.
It feels like a real wake-up call. And it's no surprise that the U.S. and its allies are actively looking for other options.
For sure. The report details this really wide-ranging effort. You've got government task forces, international collaborations.
New laws like the Inflation Reduction Act here in the U.S. and the Critical Raw Materials Act over in Europe.
It's definitely a multi-pronged approach, all aimed at securing more diverse, more reliable supply chains.
And this is where the idea of harvesting these polymetallic nodules from the deep ocean floor kind of comes into the picture as a potential alternative.
Precisely. These nodules, they're lying, thousands of meters below the surface, like little treasure chests containing significant amounts of nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper.
Exactly, the metals we need for things like electric vehicle batteries.
Right. And it's interesting, as the report points out, this isn't a totally brand new idea.
Yeah, I saw that. Back in the 70s, there was quite a lot of excitement about this.
There was. Research confirmed these vast resources were down there and that it was technically possible to get them. But then interest kind of faded in the 80s.
Why was that? What changed?
Well, primarily the economics. It just looked more expensive than traditional land-based mining back then. Plus, there wasn't a clear international legal framework for mining out in international water.
The regulation piece.
Exactly. But now, two big things have reignited interest. First, the just, explosive growth in demand for battery minerals, obviously driven by the clean energy transition.
Right.
And second, the progress may be slow, but still progress in actually establishing those international regulations.
And key player on the regulatory side is the International Seabed Authority, or ISA.
That's the one. As the report explains, the ISA operates under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and UNCLOS, and it's responsible for managing mineral resources in international waters, what they call the area.
And the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, the CCZ in the Pacific, that's the hotspot.
That's a particularly rich area for these nodules, yes. Billions of tons, apparently.
Wow. So the ISA is working on the rules for exploration and eventual commercial mining. But you mentioned the U.S. isn't a member.
Correct. The U.S. hasn't ratified UNCLOS, so that creates a unique and somewhat awkward situation for the U.S. regarding its potential involvement, influence within the ISA framework.
Okay, so we're talking about getting these nodules from incredibly deep parts of the ocean. What kind of tech are we actually talking about here? How close are we?
Well, the technology is still really in the pre-commercial phase.
Yeah.
The report describes basically two main approaches. You've got these tethered vehicles, sort of like giant underwater vacuum cleaners, using hydraulic jets to lift the nodules.
Okay.
And then there are untethered vehicles, more like autonomous robots with arms to collect them.
Right, so they've been tested.
They have, yeah, proof of concept stage. But the big challenge now is scaling these operations up for continuous large-scale economic extraction. That's the hurdle.
Okay, so the potential's there, the tech is developing.
Right.
Slowly, perhaps.
Yeah.
But just how much of our mineral needs could seabed mining realistically meet? The report really gets into the numbers, doesn't it? Focusing on nickel, cobalt, copper.
It does, and the projected surge in demand is quite striking. The report uses IEA figures, International Energy Agency, showing this massive increase in global and U.S. demand for these metals by 2040, mainly because of EVs.
How massive are we talking?
Well, in some cases, depending on the scenario, demand could be 10, maybe even 14 times higher than it was just back in 2023.
Wow. 10 to 14 times. That's staggering.
It really is. And to illustrate what seabed mining could contribute, the report uses this sort of notional example based on what some mining companies are planning.
We should.
Around 3 million tons of nodules per vessel per year. And given the typical metal concentration, say 1.3% nickel, 0.2% cobalt, and expected recovery rates, well, a single vessel could pull up a pretty significant amount of these critical metals annually.
Okay, so do the math for us.
Yeah.
What does that translate to in terms of meeting demand?
Right. So the report estimates that just a handful of these vessels, maybe anywhere from 3 to 20, could potentially cover the entire projected U.S. demand for cobalt by 2040.
The entire U.S. demand from just, say, 20 vessels max.
Potentially, yeah. Based on these projections and assumptions, nickel would need a slightly larger fleet, maybe 11 to 29 vessels for U.S. demand.
Still, that doesn't sound like a huge number of ships globally.
No, relatively speaking. And on a global scale, the report suggests maybe, 20 to 45 vessels could conceivably supply around a quarter of the world's projected nickel and cobalt needs from nodules.
That really highlights the potential scale, even with the relatively modest start to the industry.
It absolutely does.
Now, the report points out something interesting for the U.S. and its allies. Since the U.S. isn't an ISA member, direct mining in the area is tricky. But the opportunity extends beyond just scooping up the nodules, right?
Exactly. The processing and refining stages are absolutely crucial. And this is an area where the U.S. can actively participate. And interestingly, processing can account for more than half the total cost and the value.
So that's where a lot of the economic action is.
It really is. And the report notes that while most of these seabed mining companies haven't finalized their processing plans yet, there's a strong desire to actually retain ownership and a significant stake in those downstream activities.
Why is that?
Well, the unique composition of the nodules means they need specialized processing. It's not quite like land-based ores, so companies see developing that capability as a way to maximize the value they get from all the different metals.
The report mentions that initially, some might look at toll processing, using existing nickel plants.
Yes, that's a common initial tactic discussed. Basically, paying an existing facility to process the material for you. But there's a big catch highlighted in the report.
Which is?
Many existing pyrometallurgical nickel facilities, especially older ones, produce things like ferronickel or nickel pig iron. And those aren't really suitable for making the high-purity nickel sulfate needed for modern batteries.
So you need dedicated, customized processing to get the good stuff. And all four main metals, nickel, cobalt, copper, manganese.
Precisely, to produce that battery-grade material. And another really interesting point the report brings out is this general reluctance among the Western seabed mining companies to partner with Chinese firms for this processing.
Why is that? Just the diversification goal.
That's a big part of it, yeah. The core mission for many is diversifying away from China. But there are other reasons too. Technical limitations of some existing Chinese facilities for these specific nodules, concerns about intellectual property or getting locked into unfavorable partnership terms.
Ceding too much ownership.
Exactly. And then there's the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. Its foreign entity of concern rules could make partnering with Chinese entities problematic for getting those valuable tax credits. Investor preferences also lean towards non-Chinese partners.
So it really reinforces that for many in this new industry, it's not just about the bottom line, it's strategic independence too.
Definitely. Although the report does acknowledge, China's lower costs and the fact that Chinese companies are actively reaching out to these seabed miners. It's a tempting factor, for sure.
And you can't ignore China's own ambitions here, right?
Absolutely not. The report is clear. China is pursuing seabed mining aggressively. They hold the most ISA exploration contracts. They have significant influence within the ISA itself. They've declared it a national strategic objective, and they're pouring money into developing the technology.
So it's a race, in a way. But building these specialized processing plants isn't cheap. The report mentions capital costs as a barrier.
A major barrier. Getting that upfront capital is tough. The IRA production tax credits are meant to incentivize processing in the U.S. or allied countries, which is helpful.
But it doesn't solve the immediate problem of finding hundreds of millions or maybe billions for the initial investment.
Exactly. And adding to that challenge, the report suggests there's this perceived ambivalence, maybe, from the U.S. government. It's hindering investment decisions. Well, companies have apparently approached various U.S. agencies like the Defense Production Act Office, Department of Energy programs, USAID supply chain initiatives, looking for support or clear signals. But the report indicates they haven't received the kind of definitive response or strategic direction they feel they need. Creates uncertainty.
So a lack of a clear, unified U.S. strategy is a problem.
That seems to be the perception in the industry, yes. Fragmented efforts, confusion. One allied government representative is quoted anonymously in the report describing the U.S. as sleepwalking on the processing front.
Ouch. That's quite pointed.
It is. It highlights the perceived gap between recognizing the supply chain risk and developing concrete strategies to address it using potential news sources like seabed nodules.
Interestingly, the report also says the actual distance to processing sites isn't the biggest factor for these companies. It's more about finding the financing and the right partners.
Yeah, shipping costs for the nodules themselves aren't seen as prohibitive compared to the capital costs of the processing plant and securing those partnerships.
And there's a quick mention, too, about battery chemistry. The rise of LFP batteries that don't use nickel or cobalt. How does that play into this?
Well, the report suggests that if seabed mining significantly increases the supply of nickel and cobalt, potentially lowering their prices, it could actually make the traditional NMC nickel manganese cobalt batteries more cost competitive again versus LFP, so it could influence the direction of battery tech.
Fascinating interplay. And just to circle back on the policy side quickly, there was that recent news, right, about a potential shift in U.S. policy.
Yes, the report notes a Reuters story from supposedly April 2025, suggesting the Trump administration might consider a unilateral path for U.S. companies to pursue seabed mining, using an old 1980 U.S. law, the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act, bypassing UNCLS and the ISA.
And a company has already started that process.
Reportedly, yes. One company initiated an exploration license application through that domestic route. It just highlights how dynamic and uncertain the whole policy landscape is right now.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The report uses Porter's 5 Forces framework to take a first look at the commercial viability. How does seabed mining stack up against traditional land-based mining using that lens?
It's an interesting comparison. So first, rivalry. Mineral extraction is already super capital intensive, dominated by large multinationals and increasingly state-owned enterprises.
Especially China, as we mentioned.
Right. And their motivations might go beyond just profit, incorporating geopolitical leverage or supply chain resilience goals. That complicates the competitive picture significantly.
What about threat of new entrants? Is it easy to get into seabed mining?
Well, the report suggests, maybe counterintuitively, that seabed miners might face fewer barriers than, say, a small junior terrestrial mining company trying to start up.
Really? Why?
Potentially due to economies of scale on the supply side, the nodules have relatively high concentrations of multiple valuable metals compared to some land ores. And maybe lower initial infrastructure needs compared to building roads and facilities in remote terrestrial locations. However,
there's always a however.
The huge potential barrier right now is the significant public and governmental opposition due to the unknown environmental impacts. That's a major near-term hurdle for any new entrant.
Makes sense. Then there's the threat of substitutes. We touched on battery tech.
Exactly. The rapid evolution there creates uncertainty. LFP adoption is already happening, and that's factored into the demand projections the report uses. But as we said, new manganese supply from the seabed could spur alternative chemistries too. It's a moving target.
Okay, fourth force. Bargaining power of suppliers. Who supplies the seabed miners?
Primarily, you're looking at shipbuilders for the specialized vessels and manufacturers of the deep sea extraction equipment. The shipbuilding sector is quite concentrated, which could limit the miners' negotiating power on vessel costs.
And the equipment makers.
They're more likely to partner on pricing initially, the report suggests, but some could also potentially become competitors down the line if they develop their own mining operations.
Right. And finally, bargaining power of buyers. Who's buying the nodules or the intermediate product?
The processors and refiners, especially those with offtake agreements, will have considerable sway. There aren't that many potential processors equipped to handle nodules, at least initially. Adapting existing plants takes investment.
So the seabed miners might need to find buyers who are maybe in weaker positions.
Potentially, yeah. The report mentions looking towards off-takers whose traditional mines are playing out, or maybe those impacted by things like Indonesia's nickel export restrictions, or even battery recyclers who need feedstocks.
Okay, that gives a good snapshot of the commercial landscape. But the report goes much broader into the geopolitical implications. This isn't just about supply chains, is it?
Not at all. Operating in international waters under that principle of the common heritage of humankind raises really complex issues: benefit sharing, regulation, enforcement, and crucially, the impact on developing nations that currently rely heavily on traditional mining.
That potential impact on terrestrial producers seems like a major point of contention.
It's been a concern for decades, honestly. Since the 70s, developing countries, especially in Africa, have consistently voiced worries that seabed mining could just undermine their economies, even with promises of benefit sharing from the ISA.
And the report tries to model this with a case study.
Yes, it does. It looks specifically at the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, and cobalt. The DRC has the world's largest, highest-grade cobalt resources, and it's a massive producer. The model tries to estimate how seabed mining might affect the DRC government's revenue from cobalt.
Okay, so what did the model find?
Well, the findings were pretty stark. Across all 4 scenarios, they modeled different levels of impact on prices, different assumptions about how ISIS royalties might be shared. The DRC consistently experienced a decrease in government revenue if seabed mining started.
Even if they got to share the seabed mining royalties?
Yes. Even with just one seabed mining vessel operating, causing only a small drop in the global cobalt price, the model suggested the loss in the DRC's own terrestrial mining royalties would likely outweigh any money they'd receive from the ISC's benefit sharing fund.
And if more vessels start operating?
The losses become substantially larger. 10 vessels, for example, led to a much bigger hit to DRC revenue in the model. And even making the ISA royalty sharing very generous towards the DRC didn't fully offset the losses from their own reduced terrestrial royalties.
Why is that? Why doesn't the benefit sharing compensate?
The core reason, the report explains, is how those ISA royalties are structured. They're meant to be shared among all 170 ISA member states, likely weighted by population. So any individual country, even a major terrestrial producer like the DRC, only gets a relatively small slice of that pie.
Compared to keeping 100% of the royalties from mining within their own borders.
Exactly. Plus, the report points out that royalties are only part of the DRC's mining revenue. Corporate income taxes, import duties, other fees often make up a larger share. If overall terrestrial mining activity declines because seabed mining takes market share or suppresses prices, those revenues fall too, potentially exacerbating the negative impact.
So the model suggests it would take a massive reallocation of ISA funds to make countries like the DRC whole.
Pretty much. The report calculated that in the higher seabed production scenarios, something like over 90% of the entire ISA royalty pot would need to go just to the DRC to offset their projected losses, which is, politically unrealistic given the common heritage principle.
It certainly clarifies why many developing countries are wary or even outright opposed to seabed mining moving forward quickly. It poses a real challenge for designing that ISA royalty system.
No question, it's a fundamental tension.
Okay, let's zoom out again to the broader global geopolitics. Mining in international waters versus within a country's own EE, their exclusive economic zone.
Big difference, right? Huge difference. Mining in international waters, the area, requires that international cooperation, regulation via the ISA, benefit sharing. Mining within an EEZ is governed solely by that coastal state. Simpler legally, perhaps, but without the international oversight or benefit-sharing aspect.
And the report details a workshop where they really dug into these geopolitical angles using future scenarios.
Yeah, they convened experts and used scenario planning, imagining it's 2035, and seabed mining is ongoing to analyze impacts on stakeholders, U.S. strategic interests, and across what they call the DIME framework.
DIME being diplomatic, informational, military, and economic instruments of power.
That's the one. So looking through the U.S. lens, the workshop connected seabed mining directly to the techno-economic competition with China. Big surprise there.
Right.
But also saw it as an opportunity, a chance to drive investment and build partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, helping small island nations, maybe U.S. territories too. Supporting goals laid out in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, promoting a free and open region, building connections, bolstering prosperity, security, resilience.
So potential economic ties leading to security cooperation.
That was one potential pathway identified. Also, the need for increased maritime domain awareness, knowing who's doing what, where, on and under the sea. potential for Coast Guard cooperation there, plus links to climate change mitigation and oceanic science.
Okay, and breaking it down by dime, what were the key takeaways, diplomatically?
Big focus on needing clear rules and enforcement, especially if the ISA process stalls or if EEZ mining takes off. The U.S. being outside UNCLOS complicates its diplomatic role. Potential for trade disputes with countries that might ban seabed mineral imports, and needing a strategic response to China's dominance.
Informationally.
Enhanced maritime awareness is key surface and subsurface, countering potential misinformation about environmental impacts or operational activities, concerns about clandestine data collection using mining tech, need for robust info gathering, and maybe updating intelligence sharing agreements, like with the Five Eyes.
Makes sense. Militarily.
Concerns about potential territorial disputes, threats to maritime operations if regulations aren't enforced. Who does the enforcing in international waters? Parallels drawn with illegal fishing enforcement. Potential for mineral piracy, increased shipping traffic adding to sea-land security challenges. And the dual-use nature of the tech, could it interfere with submarine ops or undersea cables?
A lot of potential friction points there. And economically.
The fundamental question of whether it's actually commercially viable long-term, attracting capital is still a challenge. Companies claim straightforward costs, but profitability isn't proven. Reliability of the tech. The IRA tax credit eligibility seems okay for processing area nodules, which helps, but also potential disruption to other ocean industries like fishing or tourism, and that impact on developing country revenues we discuss.
So boiling all that down, what did the workshop participants see as the top geopolitical priorities for policymakers?
The report lists 9 key issues they prioritize. Number 1 was figuring out bilateral or multilateral rules and enforcement if the ISA framework doesn't fully materialize.
Okay. What else?
Big concerns about the environmental impact, uncertainties, and risks. Lack of clarity on enforcing international rules outside the ISA. The potential need for military force to protect mining ops. The challenge of incentivizing processing outside China. How seabed mining might worsen sea lane control issues. The basic uncertainty about commercial viability. How environmental perceptions might affect demand. And shifting goals around supply chain resilience itself.
That's a hefty list of challenges and uncertainties.
This really underscores the complexity.
So let's try to summarize then. Seabed mining, it clearly presents this really significant potential opportunity to diversify critical mineral supplies, especially for things like nickel and cobalt for batteries,
right,
potentially reducing that reliance on China we started with.
Definitely. The potential scale is there, at least on paper. But as we've just gone through, its development comes tangled in this incredibly complex web of economic questions, major geopolitical considerations, and of course, huge environmental uncertainties that we haven't even fully detailed today.
Right. And for the U.S., the report seems to really underscore that we're at a critical point, needing to decide what role, if any, it wants to play in shaping this emerging industry, especially regarding processing.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember this isn't just a story about the U.S. and China. Developing nations with existing mines could face real economic disruption. The whole global geopolitical landscape could be reshaped by how these resources are managed, how regulations evolve, and the potential for new international tensions.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. When you weigh the potential benefits of seabed mining for securing those critical minerals against the very real potential for environmental damage and socioeconomic disruption, particularly for developing nations, what core principles should guide the responsible development of this new frontier? And what role must international cooperation play in setting and actually enforcing those principles?
It's a huge question with no easy answers.
Indeed, a lot to think about.